I knew moving into Cedar Ridge Ranch Estates meant dealing with an HOA, but I didn't expect this. At sunrise last week, I stepped outside to grab a toolbox from my truck, only to catch HOA President Marla Kensington standing beside my vehicle, twirling my car keys in her hand like she'd just claimed a trophy. "This truck is in violation," she snapped. "I'm confiscating these until further notice." Confiscating? My keys? From my own driveway. Before I could say a word, she spun around, dialed 911, and told the dispatcher I was acting aggressive and threatening her safety. And I stood there thinking, "Lady, you have no idea who you just picked a fight with, because this isn't just another HOA horror story. This is the day Marla called the cops on me, without knowing I'm the sheriff of the entire county. And if she wanted a showdown, oh, she was about to get one." Before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you've ever dealt with a power-hungry HOA, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss how this ends. I moved to Cedar Ridge Ranch Estates for one simple reason. After 27 years in law enforcement, I wanted peace. Not the kind you find on a vacation, or the kind you pretend to feel during a long weekend. I wanted honest-to-God quiet, a place where I could sit on my porch, drink my black coffee, watch the sun drag itself over the ridge, and not think about arrest warrants, court cases, or emergency calls echoing through a radio on my belt. Cedar Ridge looked perfect on paper. Spacious lots, clean streets, tall pines, and a lake that glimmered like a polished coin when the wind hit it right. But, as every poor soul who has ever bought a home in an HOA neighborhood will tell you, the brochure never shows you the one thing that ruins it all. The people who believe a clipboard gives them divine authority. I didn't know her name at first. I just saw a woman in her late 40s whose walk had the urgency of someone chasing a chicken through a barnyard. She patrolled the neighborhood almost daily, hair sprayed until stiff, sunglasses so large they might have been borrowed from a 1,950 seconds movie star, and an expression permanently stuck between suspicion and superiority. It wasn't long before someone casually mentioned her nickname. Careful around that one. That's Marla Kensington, the HOA president, if you couldn't tell. Couldn't tell. I could have spotted that territorial strut from a mile away. Still, I didn't pay her much mind. I was the new guy. And I was trying to ease into retirement without putting on the sheriff persona. I didn't hide who I was, I just didn't advertise it. The last thing I wanted was neighbors treating me like a walking rule book, or waiting for me to solve their petty disputes. I'd had enough of that for nearly 3 decades. For the first 2 weeks, things were quiet. I stacked firewood, unpacked boxes, fixed the back fence, met a few friendly neighbors, and tried to pretend that living under an HOA wasn't silently gnawing at my patience. Then the letters started. At first, they were minor. Grass height exceeds the HOA's aesthetic standard. My grass was 3 inches tall. Your porch light bulb color is not consistent with neighborhood guidelines. It was a soft white LED, the same color as every other porch on my street. You placed a trash can visible from the road for more than 12 minutes after pickup. 12 minutes. Who times that? I shrugged it off. I'd spent years dealing with people far more unstable than an HOA president with too much free time. Compared to chasing meth heads through the desert or confiscating firearms from drunk hunters, a few passive-aggressive letters were practically charming. But then, the tone shifted. One evening, I stepped out to fetch the mail and found Marla standing at the edge of my driveway, staring at my property like she was calculating its sins. She didn't greet me. She didn't smile. She just clicked her pen and said, "You're new here, so I'll be generous. We expect strict compliance in Cedar Ridge. We don't want this place turning into a mess." A mess. My property was pristine. I kept it cleaner than most evidence rooms. I kept my voice calm. "If you have concerns, you're welcome to send them in writing. I don't respond to on-the-spot accusations." She didn't like that. Not one bit. Marla took a step closer, lifting her chin like she wanted to tower over me, an impressive attempt. Considering she barely reached my shoulder, "We've had trouble with new residents, thinking they're above the rules," she said. "I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen again." There was something in the way she spoke, not just authority, territorial insecurity. People like her see every newcomer as a threat to their tiny kingdom, and when they can't control someone, they escalate. Sure enough, the letters increased, twice as often, now handwritten, now urgent, now accusing me of things I hadn't even done. "Unauthorized structure behind your home." It was a garden shed, built by the previous owner. Live animals visible from the street. They were ceramic deer lawn ornaments. Suspicious tool usage. At 5:42 a.m. I opened my garage door. It became clear that Marla wasn't just checking boxes. She was targeting me. Flashbacks from the force told me exactly what this pattern meant. She needed a subject to dominate, a problem to solve, a narrative to star in. And unfortunately, I had become that narrative. But I still tried to stay patient. After all, peace was the whole point of moving here. Then came the morning that started everything, the one with the keys. I was loading tools into the back of my truck, because I had planned to spend half the day repairing the wooden trim around my workshop. I'd set my keys on the hood for all of 5 seconds, while securing a power drill in place when I heard rapid footsteps behind me, sharp, determined, territorial. There she was, clipboard in hand, eyes shining with the thrill of imaginary authority. "Clay," she said sharply, "your truck is parked incorrectly." I looked down the driveway, tires perfectly straight, not touching the road, not blocking anyone, sunlight glinting off the freshly washed paint. "Incorrect how?" I asked. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked past me, circled the front of my truck like a predator sizing up prey, and before I even registered the movement, snatched my keys off the hood. "Hey," I said, stepping forward. She raised her hand like she was holding a badge instead of stolen property. "Per HOA enforcement protocol, I'm temporarily confiscating these until we can conduct an inspection." Inspection? Confiscating? What in the world did this woman think she was running border patrol? I took a slow breath. In law enforcement, the calmest person usually wins. Marla? That's not how property law works. "Those are my keys. You need to hand them back." Her expression hardened. She stepped back like I was a dangerous criminal rather than a man in work boots holding a coil of extension cord. "You're being confrontational," she snapped, "and I won't tolerate intimidation tactics." Intimidation? Me. I was barely even irritated yet. "Give me my keys," I repeated, firmly but not loudly. She clutched them to her chest. "I will not be threatened in my own neighborhood." Then, with the dramatic flair of someone performing for an invisible audience, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911. "This part you already know," she lied through her teeth to the operator. "Aggressive male. Threatening behavior. Possible attempt to take HOA property. HOA property. My truck keys. Lord above, give me strength." But even then, I stayed calm. What she didn't know was that I'd started recording the moment she laid hands on my keys. Years of experience had trained me. When someone starts acting irrational, documentation becomes your best friend. As she performed her frantic, award-worthy dispatch call, neighbors began peeking through blinds, stepping onto porches, whispering among themselves. HOA drama spreads faster than wildfire in August. The sirens came next, fast, loud, and growing louder, and I stood there with my hands in my pockets, watching Marla puff up with confidence like she believed a SWAT team was about to march up and crown her queen. She had no idea what she'd unleashed. What was about to happen would shake Cedar Ridge to its core and end her reign in ways she never saw coming. I've seen people lose their composure before: angry drunks, stubborn ranchers, teenagers trying too hard to look tough. But there was something uniquely chaotic about watching a suburban HOA president try to wield authority she didn't actually possess. Marla stood at the end of my driveway, clutching my truck keys like she'd taken down a wanted fugitive, pacing in short little steps as she prepared her story for the arriving officers. If she'd had a podium, she probably would have held a press conference. I leaned against my truck and waited. Patience is an underrated weapon. Most people don't know what to do when the person they're trying to provoke refuses to react. Marla, in particular, was thrown off by calm voices. She thrived on conflict. Without it, her whole power structure collapsed. "You brought this on yourself," she muttered loud enough for me to hear. "All you had to do was follow the rules. The rules don't say anything about you stealing my keys." I replied. Her head snapped toward me like a bird catching sight of prey. "Confiscating," she corrected, "not stealing. You can call it whatever helps you sleep at night, but the law calls it theft." She glared, but the sirens interrupted her comeback. The sound echoed off the houses, growing louder by the second. Neighbors stepped onto their porches, phones in hand, because nothing excites an HOA neighborhood like a conflict. They didn't even have to leave their property to witness. Marla straightened her posture and smoothed her blouse, rehearsing her victim act. "Stay back," she warned me. I don't want them to think you're escalating. I'm leaning on a truck, I said. Pretty sure that's the opposite of escalating. She ignored me. 2 police cruisers rounded the corner, lights flashing but sirens now silenced. They rolled to a stop in front of my house. Tires crunching over the gravel edge. I recognized the vehicle's county patrol, same department I'd commanded for nearly a decade. It was strange being on the receiving end of a call like this. Strange, but also a little funny. The first officer out of the car was Deputy Morgan, a good kid, mid-30s, reliable, steady hands, steady heart. The second was Officer Diaz, who tended to overthink everything but had a good head for communication. Both stepped out cautiously, scanning the scene. Before they could even approach, Marla sprinted toward them like she'd been waiting to be rescued from a burning building. "Officers, officers, thank God you're here," she cried, clutching her pearls figuratively and almost literally. "He's been threatening me. He tried to snatch back HOA property, and he became aggressive when I confronted him about multiple violations." Morgan's eyebrows rose just a fraction. I could see the questions forming behind his eyes. He followed her pointed finger to me, leaning, arms relaxed, no weapon, no tension in my shoulders. "Ma'am," he said politely, "why don't you take a step back while we talk to him?" Yes, of course," she said, breathing theatrically as though she'd run a marathon. "Just be careful. He's unpredictable. If anything, my complete predictability was what unnerved her." Morgan approached me while Diaz stayed with Marla. "Morning," Morgan said carefully, his professional voice sliding into place. "Sir, we received a call." "I know," I said, "and I'll be happy to clarify." He nodded. "Is there any reason she has your keys?" "None that's legal," I replied. "She walked onto my property and took them off my truck. I recorded the whole thing." His eyes flickered. "Recorded?" I tapped my phone, still sitting on the wheel well, camera facing the driveway. "Right there, she grabbed them, refused to return them, and then called you claiming I was threatening her." Morgan took a slow breath. "All right, do you mind if I ask who you are? Just standard procedure." I reached into my jacket and pulled out my wallet, not fast, not slow, just steady, and handed it to him. He opened it, expecting a driver's license. He saw the badge. His entire posture changed. He snapped his head up, eyes widening. "Sheriff Mortensen, in the flesh," I said casually. He blinked once, maybe twice. "Sir, I didn't know you lived out here. Just moved in? Haven't made a big announcement?" "No, of course," he said quickly. "Sorry, sir, we just weren't informed." "Relax, deputy, I'm not here on duty." He nodded, exhaling. When law enforcement realizes they're dealing with a superior officer, much less the sheriff, their professional instincts kick into overdrive. Respect, caution, clarity, everything becomes sharper. "Let me get Diaz," he said. Diaz approached with Marla, still rambling behind him. The moment Morgan showed him my badge, I saw the same rapid shift in his expression. His eyes darted toward Marla, then back to me. "You called 911 on the sheriff," Morgan said to her plainly. Not even hiding the disbelief, Marla froze. The sheriff," she repeated, her voice cracking. "Him? No, that's impossible. He didn't say he never told." "I didn't realize we were required to," I said calmly. "And even if I weren't sheriff, taking someone's property and lying to 911 is still a crime." But, he was being confrontational," she insisted. "I was doing my duty as HOA president." "You don't understand, we have a system rules order." Diaz lifted his hand. "Ma'am, we understand HOA procedures, but they don't override the law. You can't take someone's keys. You can't file a false report. You can't escalate a situation like this." "I didn't file a false report," she snapped, desperate now. I felt threatened. Morgan turned toward me. "Sheriff, did you at any point raise your voice, move toward her aggressively, or give any indication of threat?" "No," I said simply. "He's lying," she shouted. Morgan looked at the still recording phone on my truck. "Ma'am, the video will verify." Her face drained of color. I pressed stop and handed the phone to Diaz. He watched the footage silently. The theft, the accusations, the 911 performance. The more he watched, the tighter his jaw became. Finally, he said, "Ma'am, this is very clearly not what you told dispatch." She started to shake. I'm the HOA president. I was just doing my duty." "Your duty," Morgan said slowly. Doesn't include stealing personal property, fabricating stories, or misusing emergency services. I didn't misuse anything, she protested. I felt unsafe. I have every right to feel unsafe. You have the right to feel however you want, I said, but you don't have the right to weaponize the police to enforce your HOA fantasies. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No words came out. Diaz stepped forward. Ma'am, by law, what you did is classified as theft and false reporting. Those are arrestable offenses. Her eyes bulged. Arrest? Arrest? You're not… No, you cannot arrest me. I'm the HOA president, Morgan sighed. That's not a legal position, ma'am. She looked from him to Diaz to me, panicking as the reality sank in. Her little kingdom, the one built on fear, intimidation, and printed HOA bylaws, was collapsing right in front of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she whispered. I was just keeping the neighborhood safe. You were keeping it under your thumb, I corrected. There's a difference. Morgan looked at me, waiting. Sheriff, how would you like to proceed? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon, and every eye in the neighborhood was locked on me. There's a moment in every confrontation where time seems to pause, where every moving piece freezes just long enough for the truth to hover above it all, waiting to see what happens next. That's exactly what it felt like, standing in my driveway, a half circle of neighbors watching, 2 deputies awaiting my decision, and an HOA president trembling like the whole world had finally called her bluff. Morgan's question lingered in the air. Sheriff, how would you like to proceed? It was a question loaded with more than legal weight. It held the weight of the neighborhood, the weight of authority, the weight of every resentment that had been simmering quietly behind HOA fences and manicured hedges, and it held the weight of one woman desperately clinging to a power she never should have had in the first place. I took a slow breath and studied Marla. She was hunched, clutching her clipboard like a life raft, her eyes darting between me and the deputies. Moments ago, she had stormed up my driveway like she owned the place, barking orders and enacting penalties as if she were leading a military operation. Now, she looked like a schoolchild caught with a hand in the teacher's desk drawer. Sheriff? She tried again, her voice cracking. I didn't mean this is all a misunderstanding, a big misunderstanding. You took my keys, I said evenly. You accused me of crimes that didn't happen, and then you weaponized emergency services to enforce your own bogus authority? She shook her head vigorously. I have authority. The HOA has guidelines, I interrupted. Not law, and guidelines don't supersede property rights. But, her voice disintegrated into a whisper, I thought I was doing the right thing. Morgan looked at me again, waiting for a decision. Most people don't know this about law enforcement, but one of the hardest things isn't deciding when to take action, it's deciding when not to. People think the badge is all about control. It's not. It's about restraint, about judgment, about knowing which actions will create safety, and which ones will simply pour gasoline on an already burning fire. Right now, arresting Marla would have been the gasoline. She was guilty, no question, theft, false reporting, misuse of 911, but the fallout would be monumental. News vans, neighborhood division, lawsuits, a full-on HOA meltdown, and beneath all that, a community where resentment would fester like mold. I wasn't here to destroy Cedar Ridge. I wanted to fix it. Deputy, I said calmly, let's start by getting my keys back. Morgan nodded and turned to Marla. Ma'am, hand over the keys. Marla blinked like she'd forgotten she still held them. Slowly, reluctantly, she opened her shaking hand. The metal jingled weakly as she let them fall into Morgan's palm. He walked them over and placed them into my hand with the same ceremony as returning a badge or a folded flag. Thank you, I said. Neighbors murmured. Some relieved, some disappointed, likely hoping for a full-blown arrest. HOA drama is currency in places like this, and a president being hauled away in handcuffs would have been a jackpot. But I wasn't done yet. I stepped closer to Marla, not threateningly, just enough to make sure she heard every word. You mishandled this situation from the start, I said. You escalated where you should have communicated. You took what wasn't yours. You lied to law enforcement. She stared at the ground. And worst of all, I added, you've been running this HOA like a dictatorship instead of a community. There it was, the truth, raw, undeniable. Several neighbors murmured in agreement. I saw heads nodding, saw relief in some faces, saw tension draining from others as though they'd been waiting years for anyone to call out what they'd been too afraid to say. Marla looked around, suddenly realizing she no longer had the room behind her. The community that once cowered under her rules now viewed her as the problem, not the solution. I was trying to help, she whispered. I didn't want the neighborhood to what? I asked. To exist without you commanding every inch of it. Her jaw tightened. I enforced the standards. Without me, everything falls apart. No, I corrected gently. Without you, things might finally come together. Morgan cleared his throat. Sheriff, we still need direction. Do you want to file charges? The deputies' hands rested lightly near their belts, not in preparation for force, but in readiness for procedure. They were professionals, waiting to see whether this HOA meltdown would turn into a legal case. My eyes met Marla's, and in that moment, beneath all her bluster and arrogance, I saw something I hadn't expected. Fear. Not fear of me, not fear of the deputies, but fear of losing the only identity she'd managed to build for herself. HOA president, enforcer, gatekeeper, take that away, and what was left? A lonely woman who needed control because she had none in her own life. I sighed. I'm not pressing charges. Several neighbors gasped. Marla's shoulders sagged in relief so hard it looked like her spine melted. But, I continued, this isn't over? Her head snapped up again. I expect the HOA board to convene a meeting within the week, I said. We're going to discuss boundaries of authority, procedural oversight, community respect, and perhaps most importantly, leadership. Whispers rippled through the audience. Marla's eyes widened. You can't remove me. I'm not removing you, I said. I'm letting the community decide whether they want you in charge. That hit harder than handcuffs. A criminal charge is a legal matter, but a vote of no confidence. That's personal, that's permanent, that's fair. Morgan said softly, echoing the crowd's sentiment. This neighborhood deserves better, I continued. Not stricter rules, not more punishments, better communication, better transparency, better respect. My voice wasn't raised, but it didn't need to be. Authority doesn't come from volume. It comes from certainty. For now, I added, I want this documented as a formal warning, and I want dispatch notified that the original report was inaccurate. We'll take care of that, Diaz said. Absolutely. Sheriff. Marla clasped her hands, trembling. I didn't mean to lie, I thought. You thought you could get away with it, I finished. And if I weren't the sheriff, you probably would've. Her lip quivered. She didn't argue. Couldn't argue, the truth was etched clearly in every witness's face. As the deputies finalized their notes, the small crowd slowly began drifting away. Some shot me grateful looks, some clapped me on the shoulder, a few muttered things under their breath about finally putting that woman in her place. Even the kids on bikes who had pedaled up to watch looked at me like I'd just won a small-town wrestling match. But Marla didn't move. She stayed rooted to the pavement long after the officers stepped back to their cruisers. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. Are you going to come after the HOA now? No, I said, but I am going to fix it. How? By reminding this neighborhood that an HOA is supposed to serve the community, not the other way around. She swallowed hard. People need rules. People need respect. I corrected. Rules without respect become abuse, and you've crossed that line more than once. Her eyes glistened, not with anger this time, but something closer to realization. I don't know how to fix this, she whispered. That's why there's a community, I said. You've forgotten that part. The deputies wrapped up their formalities, nodded to me, and headed back to their cruisers. As their engines faded down the street, a stillness settled over the neighborhood again. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the stillness that comes just before a storm breaks open. The HOA had just been shaken to its foundation, and everyone knew the next meeting was going to change everything. As the deputies pulled away, leaving just the faint rumble of their engines behind, I stood there at the end of my driveway, with Marla still clutching her clipboard, like it could shield her from the fallout she'd brought on herself. The morning sun hung high enough to cast sharp shadows across the pavement, but somehow it felt colder than it should have. The kind of cold that settles in when someone finally realizes they're no longer in charge. I didn't rush inside. I didn't slam my door or make any dramatic exits. I simply picked up the tool I'd been loading into my truck earlier, set it in the bed, and leaned against the tailgate. I wanted her to feel the weight of the moment, not through threats or shouting, just through reality settling in. "You didn't have to call them," I said quietly. She blinked, startled that I was still talking to her. I thought you'd listen if the police came. I thought you'd understand the seriousness of the HOA's authority." I couldn't help the small laugh that escaped me, more disbelief than amusement. "Marla, you called law enforcement on the county sheriff because I parked my truck in my own driveway?" Her cheeks flushed a deep crimson. Not anger, embarrassment, something she didn't feel often. "I didn't know who you were," she muttered. "That's the problem," I said. "You didn't care who I was. You just needed to be in control." She clutched her clipboard tighter. "It's not about control, it's about order." "No," I corrected. "It's about power. And you're used to people being too intimidated or too indifferent to challenge you." Her eyes darted toward the houses across from mine. Several blinds shifted as neighbors continued spying through narrow openings. HOA neighborhoods love a good scandal. They stretch it like taffy until everyone gets a taste. "I'm not a tyrant," she whispered defensively. Almost to herself, I pushed off the truck and stepped forward, not close enough to intimidate her, but close enough that she'd hear every word clearly. "You may not think you are," I said, "but what you did today, that was beyond enforcing neighborhood standards. That was harassment." Her breath hitched. Whether it was shame or denial, I couldn't tell. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my badge, turning it over in my hand. The metal caught the sunlight the same way it had earlier when I revealed it to the deputies. "If I were just another homeowner, you'd have let them haul me off in cuffs, wouldn't you?" She looked down. I don't know." "You do know," I said gently but firmly. "You made a decision based on ego, not safety." She didn't argue, didn't deny it. She was unraveling now, not because she'd been caught, but because she was being forced to confront a truth she'd buried under years of self-appointed authority. "Marla," I continued, "do you understand how serious a false emergency call is? If the deputies had come in expecting violence, they could have drawn their weapons, someone could have gotten hurt." That landed hard. Her shoulders tightened. "I didn't think of that. You should have." Silence stretched between us for a long moment, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of consequences, full of realizations, full of the uncomfortable truth that everything she built from HOA rulebooks was now collapsing around her. Finally, she looked up. "What happens now?" "That depends on you," I said, "but you need to be ready for accountability." She swallowed, her throat visibly tight. "You're calling a community meeting." "I am," I admitted. "And I'm going to present what happened factually, without embellishment. Then I'm going to propose reforms to keep this HOA from turning into a petty dictatorship." Her grip on the clipboard slackened. "They'll remove me," she whispered. "They'll vote," I corrected. "What they decide is up to them." The clipboard slipped from her hands and clattered against the asphalt. Papers fanned out across the pavement, violation notices, warning slips, checklists, her entire arsenal, spilled and exposed for what it really was. Paper shields, for someone who never understood real authority. Marla sank to her knees to collect them, but her hands shook so violently that she could barely grip the sheets. I crouched down, gathering a few pages and stacking them neatly. "You know," I said softly, "most HOAs have presidents who work with the community, not against it." She hesitated, then asked in a trembling voice, "Do you think I can fix this?" I paused because the truth deserved careful consideration. "I think you can change, but fixing this, that's up to whether the community still trusts you." She flinched at the word trust. It was a currency she'd spent recklessly for years, and now her account was overdrawn. A few neighbors had drifted closer now, under the guise of checking their mail or adjusting yard decorations. But really, they wanted to know exactly what would happen next. Word spreads fast in Cedar Ridge, and by lunchtime everyone would know the sheriff had moved in and that the HOA president had crossed the wrong man. I didn't want her to break down in front of the entire neighborhood, so I stood and offered her a hand. "Come on, let's get out of the middle of the street." She stared at my hand as if it were a foreign object. Finally, she accepted it and rose unsteadily to her feet. Her eyes shimmered but didn't spill tears. Marla wasn't the crying type. Showing vulnerability wasn't part of her brand. "You didn't have to help me," she said quietly. "People make mistakes," I replied. "It's what you do after the mistake that matters." She wiped her palms on her skirt. "What should I do?" "For now," I said. "Go home. Think, reflect, be honest with yourself and with the neighborhood. She nodded but didn't move. She lingered there like a ghost trapped between two worlds, the one where she held all the power and the one where she was finally held accountable. I know the community meeting scares you, I added, but it's a chance to start fixing the damage. She closed her eyes briefly. I don't know if they'll listen to me anymore. Then you listen to them, I said. That's how leadership works. Weak at 'em. Marla finally turned toward her home, head bowed, steps slow, spirit shaken. For the first time since moving to Cedar Ridge, she didn't walk with authority. She walked with humility, or at least the beginnings of it. I watched until she disappeared behind her front door, then let out a long breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The neighborhood exhaled too. A man watering his lawn across the street gave me a thumbs up. A woman walking her dog mouthed, "Thank you." Even the teenagers on their bikes, who usually looked bored out of their minds, gave me nods of approval. I didn't acknowledge them right away. My mind was already racing ahead. The deputies were gone. Marla was shaken. The neighbors were buzzing. But the real showdown, that was coming at the HOA meeting. Because exposing the abuse was one thing, fixing the system that allowed it, that was an entirely different battle. And I wasn't about to back down from it. I didn't expect the neighborhood to react as fast as it did. By the afternoon, word had spread through Cedar Ridge Ranch estates, like wildfire burning through every cul-de-sac, over every backyard fence, and straight into the group chats that everyone pretended they weren't a part of. You could practically feel the electricity in the air. People walked a little quicker. Porches had more spectators than usual. Even the dogs seemed to sense something dramatic had occurred. It didn't take long before the messages started arriving. First, a handwritten note slipped under my door. "Thank you for standing up to her." Someone finally did. Then, a text message from a neighbor I'd only waved to twice. "Sheriff sir, I think it's time we talk about replacing the board." By the time the sun dipped low behind the ridge, I had 10 emails, 4 texts, and 2 homemade desserts delivered to my porch, apparently in HOA neighborhoods. Sweets were a diplomatic gesture. It would have been flattering if the whole situation weren't such a mess. But while the neighbors buzzed with excitement, one person wasn't celebrating at all: Marla. She hadn't left her house once since trudging inside after our confrontation. Curtains drawn, porch light off, an event so rare for her that it became its own rumor. People whispered that she was curled on the couch in shame. Others believed she was drafting a 40-page legal defense. One man swore she'd left town entirely. They were all wrong. At about 8 that evening, there was a knock at my door, hesitant, uneven, completely unlike the sharp, commanding taps she normally used when delivering violation notices. I opened it to find Marla standing on my porch, wringing her hands, her once starched blouse wrinkled like she'd been clutching it all day. "May I come in?" she asked. The request surprised me. She was the type who preferred home turf, her office, her porch, the HOA clubhouse. The fact that she'd come here meant she was more rattled than I thought. I stepped aside and let her in. She walked slowly, like someone navigating unfamiliar terrain. "Water," I offered. She shook her head. "No, I won't stay long." She stood in the center of the living room, staring at the floor as though searching for answers in the grain of the wood. When she finally lifted her eyes, they weren't sharp, calculating, or defiant. They were exhausted. "I didn't sleep," she said softly. "Not since this morning. I'm not surprised. I've handled HOA disputes for 8 years, she continued, and I've never felt this out of control. I folded my arms. "That's because most people don't push back," she sighed. "I know. But I thought I was helping, keeping the neighborhood clean, organized, safe." "Safe," I echoed. "Marla, you called 911 on someone for loading tools into a truck. How is that safety?" Her face tightened. "I thought you were hostile." "No," I corrected. "You thought you could intimidate me." She didn't deny it. Instead, she sank onto the edge of a chair, her fingers twisting together. "Do you want to know something?" she asked quietly. "Before I was HOA president, the board was a disaster. Fights, confusion, no structure, no one took responsibility, so I did. And somewhere along the way, I said, you confuse structure with control." She exhaled shakily. "Maybe I did." Silence settled between us, heavy but not hostile. Finally, she said, "Do you hate me?" It was such an unexpected question that I nearly laughed. "No," I answered honestly. "I don't hate you. I just hate what you've become. She nodded slowly. Me too. For a moment, I saw a different version of her, not the clipboard tyrant, not the HOA warlord, but a tired woman who'd built a tower so high she couldn't climb down without falling. I know tomorrow's meeting will be ugly, she said. They'll want me removed. They might, I agreed. And you'll support that, won't you? I'll support whatever keeps this neighborhood functioning, I said. But I'm not here to punish you. I just want fairness. She rubbed her forehead. You could have pressed charges. I know. You could have destroyed me, she whispered. I didn't want to, I replied. You can still fix things, Marla. Her breath caught. Do you really think that's possible? Only if you stop hiding behind rules, I said, and start being honest with the community and yourself. She swallowed hard and stood. Thank you. For not making today worse. I opened the door for her. She stepped onto the porch, paused, and looked back with an expression stripped raw of all pretense. I'll be at the meeting, she said, and I'll listen. When she left, the night felt different, quieter, like the neighborhood had paused to breathe, but that peace didn't last. The next morning, Cedar Ridge buzzed like a hornet nest kicked awake. People walked dogs in packs just to talk about the meeting. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years suddenly reunited, bonded by mutual outrage. Some wanted Marla fired, others wanted her publicly shamed, others just wanted the HOA system dismantled entirely. By noon, someone taped flyers to mailboxes. Community meeting tonight, attendance highly recommended. Underneath in bold handwritten letters, the sheriff will be there, great. Exactly what I wanted, celebrity status, in a town where the homeowners association acted like parliament. That evening, the clubhouse was overflowing. People spilled into the hallway, stood pressed along the walls, even clustered outside the windows where they could peek in. The room crackled with anticipation, like a courtroom waiting for a guilty verdict. As I stepped inside, whispers rolled through the room like wind through dry grass. That's him, the sheriff. He stood up to Marla. Finally, someone did. The board members sat stiffly at the front table, all except one chair, Marla's, empty. Then, minutes before the meeting began, the door opened quietly. Marla slipped in, but she wasn't dressed in her usual polished, authoritative style. No blazer, no towering heels, no booklet of violations. She wore a simple cardigan and held no clipboard, walking not with command, but humility. The room murmured in shock. She approached the front and took her seat without saying a word. The board president, a timid man named Howard, who had somehow kept his position by saying as little as humanly possible, stood and cleared his throat. We're here to address concerns raised after an incident yesterday involving our HOA president and one of our homeowners. A wave of tension rippled through the room. Howard gestured to me. Sheriff Mortensen, would you please explain what happened? I stepped forward, not with anger, not with theatrics, but with calm precision. I recounted every detail, the keys, the call, the lies, the deputy's response. Not once did I embellish or dramatize. I let the facts do the talking. The room reacted with gasps, mutters, head shakes. Some people glared at Marla, others looked shocked, even betrayed. When I finished, I stepped back. Howard turned to Marla. Would you like to respond? Every eye in the room locked onto her. She stood slowly, hands trembling, voice barely above a whisper. I was wrong. The room froze. I abused my position. I acted out of fear of losing control, and I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. Not a single person moved. Even the air seemed to stop. I forgot what the HOA is supposed to be. Neighbors helping neighbors, not authority over neighbors. I lost perspective. And I'm sorry, truly. For the first time since moving to Cedar Ridge, I believed her. But apology or not, consequences still needed to be addressed. Howard cleared his throat again. We will now open the floor for discussion. Voices erupted instantly. Remove her. She should step down. Keep her, she admitted her mistakes. Reform the board. No more power trips. The clubhouse turned into organized chaos, but all of it continued to orbit the same truth. Everything had changed. This wasn't just about the keys. It was about leadership, authority, community, and whether Cedar Ridge was a prison or a home. When the crowd finally settled, the board prepared to vote, and I knew whatever happened next would define Cedar Ridge for years. The room simmered with tension as the board prepared for the vote. People leaned forward in their chairs, exchanging glances that ranged from eager to anxious. The mix of resentment, curiosity, and expectancy was almost palpable, as if the entire neighborhood had been waiting years for this exact moment, but never imagined it would actually come. Howard shuffled a stack of papers he clearly didn't need. His fingers trembling ever so slightly, he looked like a man wishing someone else would take over, as if hoping a lightning bolt might strike the clubhouse and cancel the meeting altogether. "Before we vote," he stammered, Does anyone else have something to say?" A few hands shot up immediately, but, before he could call on anyone, I stepped forward once more, not because I wanted to influence the vote, but because the room needed grounding. A few whispers fell silent, a few chairs shifted, the air tightened. I spoke calmly, making sure my voice carried without force. "I know emotions are high. What happened was serious, and there needs to be accountability, but I want to remind everyone why we're here." Eyes lifted toward me, even the ones that had been staring daggers at the back of Marla's head. "We're not here to punish a person," I said. "We're here to fix a system that let things get this bad." A few heads nodded, a few arms crossed defensively. That was fine. Change takes time. We all bought homes here because we wanted peace, safety, and a sense of community. None of us came here to wage war over porch lights, grass height, or parking angles. A ripple of uncomfortable chuckles moved through the crowd. "We want fairness," I continued. "Transparency, respect, not fear, fear of violations, of retaliation, of being singled out." More nods now, stronger ones. "And yes," I added, "the HOA president overstepped, significantly, but removing a leader isn't the same as fixing an organization. If we don't address the structure, this will happen again with someone else sitting in that chair." That hit a nerve. I could see it. People shifted in their seats, murmuring to one another. "Reform," I said. "Has to be more than a firing. It needs to be a reset." Howard cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff, are you suggesting changes to the bylaws?" "I'm suggesting changes to everything," I said plainly. "Checks and balances, clear boundaries, clarity on what authority the HOA actually has and what it does not." The murmuring grew louder now, energized. "And most importantly," I added, turning toward Marla, "leadership that listens." Her eyes glistened, not with fear this time, but with something closer to acceptance. I stepped back. Howard exhaled. "All right, the board will now vote." He explained the process: simple majority, confidential ballots, counted publicly. One by one, the board members marked their papers and deposited them in a small wooden box that looked like it had been used for everything from raffle tickets to Christmas cookie drawings. As the final vote slipped into the box, the room held its breath. Howard opened the container, removed the slips, and began reading. His voice trembled on the first name: "Remove." The room stirred. Second slip: "Remove." Faint gasps, a few whispers, a tight grip on my shoulder from someone behind me. Third slip: "Retain." A murmur of surprise. Fourth slip: "Remove." Now the tension was suffocating. Only one vote left. Howard held the final slip delicately, as though touching it might burn him. He unfolded it slowly, too slowly. "Remove." The room erupted, not with cheers, not with screaming, but with a complex, layered explosion of emotions: relief, shock, vindication, sympathy, certainty. Marla was no longer HOA president. Her face went pale, her hands gripped the table as if trying to steady herself. For a moment, I thought she might fall, but she didn't. She stayed upright, barely, but upright nonetheless. Howard cleared his throat. "The position of president is now vacant, effective immediately." The crowd released another wave of chatter. "We will hold a special election at the end of the month. Until then, Vice President Linda Carver will assume the interim role." Linda stiffened in her seat. She had the look of someone who very much did not want the job. Marla slowly sank back into her chair, staring blankly at the table. Her clipboard wasn't there to cling to anymore. Her authority had evaporated in less than 10 minutes. The meeting could have ended there. It should have ended there, but Marla stood. The room went silent. Her voice, fragile but steady, carried across the clubhouse. "I accept the board's decision." A few heads jerked up in surprise. "And I won't contest it." No one breathed. "I understand why this happened," she continued. "I pushed too hard. I ignored too much. I didn't listen." Her throat tightened. "I thought enforcing rules made me important, useful, needed." Her voice cracked slightly as she added, But the truth is, I stopped being part of this community the moment I tried to control it. She wiped her cheek quickly, discreetly. I'm sorry. To all of you. To any of you I've hurt through the years. And especially to Sheriff Mortensen. You didn't deserve any of this. She stepped back, eyes lowered, and for the first time since I'd met her, the room looked at her not with fear, not with resentment, but with recognition. She was human, flawed, broken in places, but, willing to admit it, Howard, still stunned, dismissed her gently. Thank you, Marla. She nodded once, then quietly took her seat again. The room felt heavier after her words, but calmer, like a storm had passed. Howard continued the meeting, discussing proposed reforms, including limiting the HOA president's authority, requiring board votes for enforcement actions, establishing a homeowner grievance committee, banning unilateral inspections, documenting all violations with photos, and, most importantly, prohibiting board members from approaching homeowners confrontationally. People responded with enthusiasm, almost hunger. They wanted change, real change, and they weren't afraid to say so anymore. Voices rose with ideas, complaints emerged, solutions surfaced. It was the most productive HOA meeting the community had seen in years, maybe ever. Near the end, someone stood and asked, "Sheriff, will you run for president?" The room erupted with murmurs, some hopeful, some shocked, some thrilled. I raised my hands. No, absolutely not. Laughter rippled through the crowd. I didn't move here to run an HOA, I said. I moved here to enjoy my life. But we trust you, someone insisted. And I appreciate that, I said with a smile. But trust shouldn't rest on one person. We need a system, not a hero. That seemed to satisfy them. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors gathered around me, some to thank me, others to ask my opinion on reforms, and a few simply wanting assurance that the chaos was finally over. Eventually, people filed out into the cool night air, buzzing with excitement and relief. Only Marla remained behind. She approached me slowly. "Thank you," she said, voice steady. "Not for what you said, for not humiliating me. You did the hard part," I told her. She hesitated. "I want to make this right, not as president. As a neighbor," I nodded. "Then start showing up, not to enforce rules, but to listen." She gave a small, grateful smile before leaving the room. As the door closed behind her, I exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the day finally lift. But I knew the journey wasn't over yet. The neighborhood had changed tonight, but change, real change, takes time. And tomorrow would bring the consequences, the rebuilding, and the test of whether Cedar Ridge could truly grow into something better. The next morning, Cedar Ridge Ranch Estates felt different. Not quieter, not louder, just charged, like the air itself wasn't sure what to do with the aftermath of last night's meeting. For the first time since I'd moved in, people weren't avoiding eye contact when they walked past my house. They waved, they smiled. Some even gave those small nods that said, "You did good," without needing to say it out loud. I stepped out onto my porch with a mug of coffee, the same routine I'd carried over from 27 years of early law enforcement shifts. But now, instead of scanning for trouble, I watched people going about their lives with a lighter stride. Almost immediately, I spotted old Mr. Abernathy across the street trimming his rose bushes. He lifted his shears in salute. A few minutes later, a pair of teenagers biked past and shouted, "Nice job, Sheriff," before nearly colliding with a mailbox. Even that made me smile. What struck me wasn't the gratitude, it was the shift in spirit. For the first time, these folks seemed to believe they had a say in their own neighborhood. Fear had been replaced with possibility. I took another sip of coffee just as someone cleared their throat behind me. I turned to find Linda Carver, the interim HOA president, standing at the bottom of my porch steps, holding a folder like she was hoping it might shield her from responsibility. "Sheriff," she said nervously. "Linda," I greeted. "What brings you by?" She climbed the steps, careful not to spill the papers inside the folder. Well, since I'm acting president now, I'm trying to get ahead of the transition. The board asked me to speak with you about the reforms you suggested." I motioned for her to sit. "I'm happy to help. But remember, you're the one leading the HOA now. Trust yourself." She sat stiffly. "That's the problem. I never wanted this. I'm only vice president because no one else volunteered. And honestly, after watching Marla, well, I don't want to end up like that." I leaned back and studied her. Linda was the opposite of Marla in every way, soft-spoken, thoughtful, almost apologetically polite. It was clear she'd spent years letting the stronger personalities push her into the background. "You won't turn into her," I said. "As long as you lead with humility, you'll be fine." She opened the folder. "These are the proposals the board drafted last night. I'd appreciate your thoughts." I skimmed the list, everything from enforcement limits to a new conflict resolution committee, to a requirement that all violations include photographic evidence and board approval, not just one person's interpretation. "Looks good," I said. "You're giving power back to the community." "That's the plan," she said. "We want to prevent, well, what happened yesterday." "That's all anyone can ask." She hesitated before adding, "Do you think people will accept me as interim president only if you stop asking permission to lead?" I said. "Authority doesn't come from confidence. It comes from consistency." She thought about that for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." Before she left, she added softly, "And thank you for not tearing Marla apart publicly. It meant more than you know." When she was gone, I found myself staring down the driveway where Marla had stood just a day earlier, clutching my keys like she owned my entire life. It was hard to believe how quickly things had shifted, how a position that once seemed unshakable had collapsed under its own weight. But that's the thing about power. When it's built on fear, it falls apart. The second fear disappears. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, not as sheriff, just as a man getting to know his community. As I strolled past manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs, people stopped me to say thank you or share grievances they'd kept bottled up for years. Stories of petty violations, meaningless fines, intimidation tactics, things they'd never dared to voice. "You think things will get better now?" one woman asked as she weeded her flower bed. "They already are," I said. "You're speaking up." Then, in the distance, I spotted Marla sitting on her porch. She wasn't holding a clipboard. She wasn't watching the neighborhood with hawk-like intensity. She wasn't standing tall and authoritative. She was sitting quietly, almost peacefully, staring out across the yard. Part of me wanted to keep walking, not out of resentment, but out of respect for her space. But I also knew running from someone who had finally stepped into humility wouldn't help either of us grow past what happened, so I walked toward her. When she noticed me approaching, she straightened slightly, not out of defensiveness, just surprise. "Sheriff?" she said with a small, nervous smile. "Morning," I replied. "Mind if I sit?" She motioned to the empty chair beside her. "Of course." I sat, letting a few seconds of silence pass. It wasn't awkward, just thoughtful. "How are you holding up?" I asked. She exhaled. "Better than I thought, worse than I hoped." "That's honest." "I've had a lot of time to think," she said. "Last night was humbling. It needed to be." "I know." She looked down at her hands. "The truth is, the power went to my head. I thought I was the only one holding this place together. I see now I was the one tearing it apart. That insight is a good start." She chuckled lightly. "Doesn't feel good. Growth rarely does." We watched a couple walk their dog down the street in comfortable silence. "Finally," she said, "I'm going to join the reform committee." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "I think it's time I learn how to be part of this community instead of ruling over it." "That's a healthy decision." She smiled faintly. "You won't have to worry about me calling 911 anymore." "I wasn't worried," I said. "I just hoped you'd learn from it." She nodded. "I'm trying." As I stood to leave, she added, "Thank you, Sheriff. Not for going easy on me, but for giving me the chance to do better." "That's all anyone deserves," I replied. Walking home, I realized something important. Leadership isn't about badges or titles or authority. It's about influence, example, and the courage to hold people, including ourselves, accountable. Cedar Ridge had taken its first step toward becoming a community again, and though I had played a part in it, the real work would come from the people who called this place home. I looked around at the quiet houses, the children biking in the street, the adults chatting at the end of driveways. Cedar Ridge wasn't perfect, but it was trying, and that was enough. It felt good to belong somewhere worth fighting for. If there's anything this story taught me, it's that authority without accountability turns dangerous fast. Power, no matter how small, can blind people when they use it as a shield instead of a responsibility. But the opposite is also true. Communities can heal when people are willing to admit their mistakes and choose growth over pride. In Cedar Ridge, we didn't just fix an HOA problem, we learned a lesson about respect, empathy, and standing up when something isn't right, even if it ruffles feathers. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment of truth to remind everyone what community is supposed to be. So tell me down below, have you ever dealt with an HOA power trip or someone who let authority get to their head? Share your story and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next HOA showdown coming soon.